think that this is the 10th time that I have welcomed here. And we are very happy that you have come and joined us once again at a time when things are very important for Europe. Now, you can't discuss Europe without having you with us. Chancellor, I know that you are involved in important negotiations in Berlin at the moment, and that is why we appreciate it all the more that you have found the time to come and speak to us today. I think it shows the importance that you attach to Europe and international affairs. That is the reason, I'm sure, why you're here. Welcome, Chancellor.
Ja, sehr geehrter Herr Professor Schwab.
Well, Professor Schwab, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let me say I'm delighted to be back in Davos in a year that, well, finds me in a very special situation, but let me come to that later on. Let me remind all of us on this day where Europe is very much at the top of the agenda of this forum in Davos, that 1918, 100 years ago, the First World War came to an end, which is called the seminal catastrophe of the 21st century. Even worse catastrophes were to follow. In a way, the political actors almost sleepwalked into a horrendous situation. And we today, 100 years later, have to ask ourselves, when we have less and less people who have actually witnessed this time of the Second World War, we have to ask ourselves a very pertinent question. Have we actually learned the lessons of history? And I think we haven't really. This generation that was born after the Second World War will have to prove that we have truly learned the lessons. The lessons that we drew was at the foundation of the United Nations, a multilateral answer, an answer of cooperation. A quarter of a century later, we had the end of the Cold War. We had the Cold War, the splitting of the world in two blocks, but then this was overcome. And this opened up a true opportunity for multilateralism, for working together. And in 2008, 2009, there was a multilateral response to the global financial crisis, where the G20 was founded, where Argentina this year holds the presidency, and the presidency was held by us last year. We, under the German presidency, had the motto, shaping an interconnected world. Global cooperation was what we tried to bring forward in an environment that wasn't all that easy. We made progress as regards global cooperation in the health sector, in partnership with Africa, in the Global Steel Forum, which was to deal with dumping and fair trade. We also tried to strengthen the role of multilateral organizations. We try to come out in favor of an open world trade system. As regards the great challenge to mankind, climate change, unfortunately, we already had to draw our conclusions without the United States. But still, climate change is a great danger. We know that there are national egotisms. We see populism on the rise. We see in many states a polarizing atmosphere and a polarized state of affairs. Many people seem to worry, will multilateralism actually find an answer to tackling the problems that people have, that mankind has, in a fair and equitable way? And also, if we look at the great challenge of the disruptive changes of that technology, modern technology offers, this digital change, many people seem to doubt that in many countries. And this is why I think, Professor Schwab, that this motto, creating a shared future in a fractured world, is the appropriate motto for the world that we see in 2018. And frankly speaking, the country which I have the honor to represent, where I am Chancellor, has difficulties. This polarization is something that we see in our country as well, which we haven't had for decades. And this, I think, is due to the fact that we have two factors, because also of globalization, the euro crisis, and I think we've coped quite well with this, and the challenge that migration has posed over the past few years. But let me tell you, Germany And all of the talks that I currently hold and that I will continue to hold to form a government, Germany wishes to be a country that will lend its contribution also in future to solve the problems of the world together. We think that shutting ourselves off against the rest of the world, isolating ourselves, will not lead us into a good future. Protectionism is not the proper answer. We believe that if we are of the opinion that things are simply not fair, that there is no reciprocity, that then we have to seek multilateral answers to this and not pursue a unilateral protectionist course where we isolate ourselves against the others. So obviously, it's of the essence that we form a government as quickly as possible in Germany. I hope we will be able to do so. We hold talks, as you know, and we are guided in those talks by two main thoughts. The first one is, how can we ensure and secure prosperity for the people in Germany, for our country? Right now, we're in a very good situation. We're doing very well. We have had growth for 11 consecutive years. The last time that happened was in the 50s. We have more people gainfully employed than ever before. We have sound finances. We have made enormous progress in digitalization, in the economy called 4.0. But, and let me be very open, we are not leading the way in other areas of the digital world. For example, society, the state. So the next few years to come will have to be under the heading, let us bring digital into our education system. Our state has to be digitized. People have to be able to communicate with their state representatives through digital, and a better ecosystem, as it were, for startups has to be created so that we can make further progress, so that we can again be a cradle of innovation. This is a very serious challenge. We have no time to lose because we know that other parts of the world are developing very, very quickly. And we also see countries such as Estonia, for example. Estonia, that they had just had the presidency in the European Union, are far advanced by comparison. And Germany is indeed lagging behind, is not leading in Europe. At the same time, we know digitalization means that, well, there has to be lifelong learning. We have to deal with completely new solutions as regards our social systems. That is to say, we have to be aware of the fact that these disruptive technological changes invariably mean disruptive changes for our societies. And the readiness, particularly in a society that is growing ever older, such as Germany, well, there is not that much of a preparedness to get used to these new developments. So the question is not, what can I distribute of the common weal, but how can I ensure prosperity for the future? That's what we have to concentrate on. And I know that if we actually want to fulfill the promise of prosperity for all in the future as well, in this new digital world, we need a social market economy 4.0, not only an industry 4.0. And that means we also have to deal with the question, how can we draw others into the fold, not leave them behind? I think that's a very, very important question for all of those countries. Countries that are split, that are fractured, will not be able to actually act in this cooperative spirit. There's a great danger that they will be inward-looking and be left behind in Europe. So all of these questions are of the essence, are indivisibly linked to the question what's happening in Germany, but also to the question what's happening in Europe. All of these problems can only be solved if we look at India, China. These giants can only be solved by cooperation within the European Union. And it's interesting, although it's obviously regrettable that the citizens of the United Kingdom have opted for leaving the United Kingdom. At the same time, this has almost encouraged us to concentrate on the big issues. And let me say very clearly, with the election of the French President Emmanuel Macron, there has been a new impetus which will strengthen us. So what do we have to do? At a time where not all of the member countries of the European Union say, we want an ever closer union, that's exactly what we want. Well, we have to learn to find responses for the big issues in the Union, and also try to solve those important questions by the people on the ground where they are. Otherwise, we will not create a good climate for Europe. And we have to develop our economic strength now that we have, we haven't exactly left behind the euro crisis completely, but we, I think, have tackled it quite well now that there is growth in almost all European countries, now that there is more employment. We now have to reorientate our economic policy, which means creating more of a digital single market. And here, I think, we are under great pressure because we have big American companies that have access to data. Data will be the raw material of the 21st century, are the raw material of the 21st century. And the question, who owns those data, will decide in the end whether democracy, a participatory social model, and economic prosperity, economic progress can be combined. There are other countries, for example, China, where there's very close cooperation between the authorities of the state and those who collect the data, where there's they're almost one and the same. The Europeans haven't yet decided how to deal with those data. The danger that we will lag behind, that we're too slow, that we'll be overtaken by events while we are debating philosophical issues is a big one. So there has to be action. But I think that this European model of a social market economy gives us a good chance to lend a contribution to a fairer and more equitable digital age, where it's not a situation where privately owned data are the order of the day, but where we will see to it that those data are shared in such a way that we ensure prosperity for all people. Secondly, we have to strengthen the euro zone. That means we need a capital market union. Our capital markets are still fractured. We have to complete the banking union. And we also have to reflect how we can weather the crises that loom on the horizon. How can we make ourselves so resilient that liability is not communitarized, that risks are not communitarized, and that then each and everyone is liable, although actually the community as a whole is liable, although each and every country ought to manage its own liabilities. So, again, let us not shut ourselves off towards others. Let us keep pace with the best in the world, and let us actually canvass for this multilateral approach. There's another very important task ahead if we want to be taken seriously as Europeans. That is to say, we need to cooperate on the foreign policy front. This common European foreign policy has not yet been developed sufficiently. And if we, with our then 27 member states, are not able to send a clear and unequivocal signal and a united signal to big countries such as China, such as India, such as the United States of America, if our foreign policy is made nationally and we try to be a player in the world, we will fail. We have a lot of work still to do, simply because we cannot be certain that we can absolutely rely 100% on each other. I'm very glad to note the presence of the German Minister of Defense here. After decades of discussions and in view of the challenges ahead, we have finally been able to actually initiate a European defense policy. This is very important for two reasons. First, this is not a cooperation that in any way is directed against NATO. Quite the contrary, we're very pleased and gratified to know that the NATO Secretary General said, he was present actually there when this was founded, that he feels that this is a complement to NATO. And we also think this could be a very good approach towards other countries, where we say we want to forge a common approach as regards security issues, as regards development issues, and also economic issues. We would like to combine all of these different issues and develop a coherent and consistent model with regard to Africa, for example. Now, why is this common foreign policy, this common security policy, so important important and this common economic policy so important? Well, in Europe's immediate neighborhood, we have a large number of global conflicts. We have seen this when globalization came to Europe in 2015. It came actually home to us because of the large flow, when we saw the large inflows of migrants and of refugees from Syria. Well, we did not deal with the issues, for example, in Libya, in Iraq, and in other places. My colleague has just now outlined the sheer dimension of this great challenge through migration. We have IS on our threshold. We have the Shiite mission on our threshold. Africa is very close to us. Syria is the neighbor of Cyprus. So the fact that Europe, in its foreign policy, has not been all that active in the past. We quite often relied, as regards our security, on the United States of America, but now they concentrate on themselves and their own security. All of that needs to tell us a lesson. We need to take more responsibility. We need to take our destiny into our own hands, and that's what we did by forging this new defense cooperation and also looking more at the challenges of migration. We know there are still differences of opinion and differences of approach within the Union on this, but we'll continue to work on this. We are also clear that we need to protect our external borders. But what does this mean? Europe, it's an interesting unity, if you like. We have actually given ourselves a common currency, but we've never really reflected at some length what happens when this currency gets into danger. Now we're actually sort of working on the foundation, which we should have done in the first place. So we were always very proud of freedom of movement. You don't have to show your passport when you travel around in the Schengen areas. But we never really thought that much about protecting our external borders. When you look at it in hindsight, we think, well, how could we miss out on this? How could we never think about this? We felt safe and secure. Now we're working on an entry-exit system. Now we have Frontex. And all of that was established over the past 2 and 3 years. But there's one thing that's also true. Ever since the Roman Empire, ever since the Chinese War, we know that only shutting ourselves off doesn't help to protect your borders. You also need good cooperation with your neighbors. You need good agreements, valid agreements that are respected, international treaties that are respected by each and everyone in order to try and manage this problem of illegal migration. And this is what we did when we forged our partnership programs with Africa and also the treaty with Turkey. But we know we're responsible because if the gap of prosperity becomes too large, then those treaties will not be respected in an open world. We bear also responsibility for the further development of the African continent. We're responsible for what happens to Iraq. We're responsible to what happens to Libya. Here we've been hesitant, we've been a little bit reluctant, but I think slowly but surely we have worked on this and have also had first results and successes. But there is, I think, a great convergence within the European Union, much more than on what happens once the refugees are in the Union. How do we distribute them? It is true. Unfortunately, we do not as yet have any unified opinion on this, but we're working on it. And that brings me to the challenge, cooperation with Africa. Only if we ourselves are economically strong, we will have the necessary strength to forge such a cooperation with Africa. But I think that this is of the essence. I think it's very, very important. To me, this is personally important because we as Europeans have a great debt to fulfill from colonial times vis-à-vis Africa. And we have a vested interest that Africa develops sensibly. Africa, I mean, you can say Africa, but these are over 50 states with totally different levels of prosperity, totally different developments. So this compact with Africa, for a very good reason, was called Compact with Africa, because we don't want to adopt a paternalistic approach, but we want to be at eye level with our African partners, and we want them to also share in the prosperity of the world so that their growth does not outpace their economic development. So it's a completely new approach to development cooperation. We want to help them and be partners in this economic development. There's one problem. Let me come back to Europe. We all very much regret the fact that the United Kingdom will not be a member of the European Union for long. Tomorrow you will receive here my colleague Theresa May. Let me say for Germany, but also for all of us, we want to have a good partnership with Britain also in the future. We will be very clear as regards the questions connected with exit, because obviously participation in the single market is contingent on the freedoms and freedom of movement as well. But we are very closely linked to Britain. We have shared interests on foreign policy, on economic policy, and it is in their hands how close they want this partnership to be. We will be very open-minded as regards a close partnership. Ladies and gentlemen, I try to make it very clear to you what I see as being essential in this fractured world and what we can do. I think we always have to start at home. The better we can overcome divisions at home, the freer we will be to engage with others in multilateral fora. The solutions are always similar. Let us never accept a situation where people are left behind, particularly in these times of enormous disruptive changes of the digital age. This division, overcoming those fractures, is one of our most important tasks. Mr. Schwab, we spoke about this. You are promoting networks that try to initiate dialogue between the economy and the society. What would be an ethically acceptable way of managing this new digital economy? If we don't manage this, we will have Luddites as we used to have them in the industrial age. You too live in your industries off. You live off preconditions that you have not created. All of them come from a different age. So please help us to create the environment that is conducive to prosperity also in the future. If 20%, 30% can be convinced of the boon of this digital age and this disruptive technologies, this will not be sufficient. We need to find more people who are in on this. You have to invite these people because they will simply not always be able to follow this enormous speed. They will then be left behind, and this is something that we cannot accept. So let me welcome very much this Davos Forum's issues, this discussion forum. We can prevent, I think it's very valuable, we can prevent in this way that we make the mistakes of the 20th century again. We know that the possibilities that are open with this new disruptive technological age are good, but they are also bad in the sense that they can create enormous confusion, that people feel left behind, that they can be detrimental in this particular sense. So we have to create truly a social market economy, as we call it in Germany, also in this digital age, and then cooperation in the world of tomorrow will work. So we will stand up for this. And please, keep your fingers crossed for us getting into government as quickly as possible. Thank you very much.
Chancellor Merkel, you really took the words out of my mouth. A platform between politics, the economy, and civil society. And I think it is very important that these new technologies are user-friendly, that they help society. With regards to technology, you spoke about data. You said that the new currency in the new industrial society will be data. Now, I would like to ask you about the next factor, data and artificial intelligence. And if you look at the efforts that are being made by governments, for example, in China and in other countries, I think that we have the feeling sometimes that Germany applies artificial intelligence, but is not really in the first place in terms of its development. Is that a concern?
Well, I try to be very candid about this. Well, things are working, well, somewhat more or less. Administration is working more or less, so it's so difficult to say to people that all of that in future will have to be handled through an internet platform. If I see, for example, that in China about 1 billion people are actually using those internet platforms to manage virtually their whole life, that's a situation that, well, for countries that come from a development stage which is perhaps not quite as high as the one of Germany, it seems to be easier for people sort of to leapfrog certain developments. We in Germany have two problems, essentially. One is that matters seem to work, more or less, so people don't see a need. But tomorrow, this will not be sufficient. And we're an aging population, so people are not getting more curious. And that's what we need to manage. We have to do it in school, we have to do it in our educational sectors, we have to teach our young people. That's where we have to set our priority for the next 4 years. You're absolutely right. In a certain number of countries, you have very much of a strategy of artificial intelligence and state programs, state-owned programs. We have to be more focused, not sort of one research project here, one research project there. But there is, for example, this idea of a Franco-German research policy on artificial intelligence, because it will not all be all that easy with the swapping of intellectual property, and also patent register is limited for the time being. Some of it is happening without patent being registered in the traditional way. So I'm open-minded about this. I feel that we're under pressure, however. And this sense of urgency may perhaps not be sufficiently developed in broad parts of Europe. The problem is we will only be able to create jobs for our young people if we invest in these new areas. The old technologies, well, that would not be sufficient. There's not that much investment there. The jobs of old will not be filled with young people. And we will also have to be vigilant in the sense that we have to have competitive tax systems without creating a situation where people have the impression that big corporations don't need to pay taxes. So France and Germany have an interest to develop a common corporate tax system, so I don't think we ought to complain about the United States here. We have to forge policies that are in line with WTO standards, but we will have to, stand in international competition.
Chancellor, you were saying that strengthening Europe and strengthening solidarity in the area of foreign policy, in terms of defense policy, was important, but you didn't mention the finance sector. How do you see that? What do you think will happen in the future? Do you think that there will be greater solidarity in Europe in the finance sector?
That's what internally I meant. We need to strengthen the Eurozone. Capital Market Union is something that I mentioned, the banking union. And I think we need that, but the question is, how far does each and everyone have to do his or her own homework? I mean, that's always the same with all of the rescue programs that we adopted at the European level. That was always the first question. And to what extent do we need to communitarize those safety mechanisms? For example, the ESM that we've developed for those programs where we work together with the IMF and are continuing to work together with the IMF, we would like to turn this more into a European monetary fund without obviously being able to do without the competence of the IMF. We need their expertise, and I want to say this particularly since Christine Lagarde is here in the audience. We have every respect for their economic expertise, and we need this. We also need a sort of final backstop for the banks in order to sort of get a better separation between the sovereign debt and the banks, and also the involvement of the state and private bankings. We have a European monetary union, a European economic and monetary union. The monetary union is working okay, but we are far from having an economic union. Jacques Delors, even before the euro was introduced, spoke about the need for doing this, and we need to develop this more because the competitiveness of the member states of the European Union is very, very different.
Chancellor, you were saying that protectionism is not the right answer, and I quote you there. What can we do to ensure that multilateralism can be maintained and can be strengthened?
Well, what we see in the European Union, and for many of you who look at it from the outside, it is perhaps a cultural shock to see how 27 or 28 members for the time being try to find a solution. That's multilateralism as essential. We have this in Germany as well, because we have 16 Länder, 16 member states in the Federal Republic of Germany, and every time we have to find a compromise with them. So we have to have patience to find multilateral solutions. It sometimes seems to people that it's much faster to act nationally, but then immediately you're met with a national response by others who react to this, and the thread of communication, the channel of communication is broken. So I think it is well worth our while to act, to have the patience, to muster the patience for multilateral action.
If one looks at the members from overseas who are here, I think that there is always a concern with regard to populism in Europe. We're talking of 10, 15%, which the populist parties represent. Do you think that that is likely to grow? Or is it under control, do you think?
Well, I certainly sincerely hope that it's not going to grow. We're trying to get it under control, but it's a poison. Because every time you have unsolved questions, unsolved problems, and I told you this happened in Germany, this grew in Germany because during the euro crisis, there was an impression apparently as if others were living off back, sort of living of our prosperity. And then you have a situation with migration, for example, this great influx that people, that something is kept from people, something is taken away from them. And if that comes together with unemployment, for example, this is a very poisonous mix where people feel, well, we have to rely on ourselves, the others are the aliens, then you have groups at the end of that road within the society who are marginalized. So I said it's very, very important to draw the right conclusions and learn the right lessons from the past. One point during the euro crisis, for example, not talking about migration now, was that we said, oh, it's the way of the Greeks. You know, the Germans are tight-fisted and the Greeks are totally different. When you start talking about other nations in such stereotypes, Americans are protectionist by nature, the Germans are this by nature. Well, I already said tight-fisted, so austerity, yes, that's a thing of the past. Oops. So you're actually generalizing. You're speaking in generalities, and that is, the next thing is, Muslims are like this, Christians are like this. You have to look at every individual. It's a lot of work, but as long as you do not respect each and every person's individuality and already have your preconceived notion about a person before you've actually talked to them, that is the very basis of populism.
Ciao. This is perhaps a more personal type of question that I'd like to ask you. Over the last few months, things have been a little bit difficult. You've been involved in difficult negotiations. And from my own perspective, and I'm a bit older, I think that this is something that we learn from all these phases. We've, of course, had experiences with this. Can I ask you, what have you actually learned from what has happened over the last few weeks?
Well, we haven't yet brought those negotiations to a close. Well, patience has proved to be of the essence. And there was one thing that I've become increasingly aware of is that people always say, well, you need a stable government. I think once you thought this through, I think I've actually thought this through even much more intensively than in the past. I am now convinced even more that it's most important for the capacity of a country to act politically. I'm very glad to be here in Davos, but I think I usually concentrate much more on Germany. How much changes during 1 month? How many things happen in such a comparatively short time, and how fast time moves these days. And if a country wants to give a contribution to globalization, it has to be actually capable of action all around the clock.
The basis for a coalition agreement, Chancellor, have been established, and your partner SPD has signed off on this agreement last weekend. I think that we can look to the future with a degree of optimism. And we would like to wish you, for the final stretch, all the very best. And we are there and have been there to support you as we have over the last few years. Thank you.
Please don't pity me.
Yes, we learn from you.
Und hat mich gefreut heute.
Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure to be with you today.